From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right, I think we're going to get started. This is our next panel for the Section 1201 rulemakings. This is Class 1 Audiovisual Works, Criticism and Comment, eBooks, and Filmmaking. My name is Regan Smith. I'm Deputy General Counsel of the Copyright Office, and I think at first the panelists will introduce themselves. We'll go over the rules of the road, and then we'll get started.
Emma Kleiner, Ringer Fellow at the Copyright Office.
Kevin Amer, Senior Counsel in the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the Copyright Office.
Anna Chauvet, Assistant General Counsel at the Copyright Office.
Jason Sloan, Attorney Advisor in the General Counsel's Office at the Copyright Office.
Stacy Cheney, Senior Attorney Advisor at NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration.
Okay, and so in terms of the panelists, some of you have participated, some of you have not before. We're glad to see everyone here. This is being recorded and it's also being transcribed, so make sure to speak clearly into the microphone and turn it on if you're going to speak. If you wish to opine on an issue, just tip your placard up and we'll call on you. We endeavor to let everyone get a chance to speak as to a particular question, but the goal of these hearings is really to refine the written record that many of you have already submitted, that we're already looking at, and hone in on areas where the evidence may be patchy or where an issue may be in great dispute. Because of our technology, if you could turn your microphone off after you've spoken, that will reduce feedback. And also please remove your phone from being close to the microphone. There is a very large number of panelists on this panel, which we think is great, but in order to aid our court reporter, we have to request that each time you speak, you repeat your name so that he can understand who is speaking. So Class 1 is Audiovisual Works, Criticism and Comment. The Register of Copyrights has already determined that it may be appropriate to renew the existing temporary exemptions to the prohibition on the circumvention of access controls, and that is the last rulemaking cycle with 7 classes. We've condensed it into one due to examine whether there may be sort of shared efficiencies, and given the large demand, we then sort of collapsed it back out into 3 hearings to accommodate all of the participation. So the focus on this, although it is Class 1 in general, is on issues really affecting modifications to ebooks or filmmaking exemptions that are currently adopted by regulation. And I think to start out, we will have a short presentation from Michael Donaldson, which we are going to label Exhibit 1A. There's another presentation, and then I also have, in terms of housekeeping, a request to submit a book called Documentary Film by Ms. Ofterheide. Did I say that close to right? Okay, I'm getting a nod. That maybe, if no one has any objection, will be 1C. So before Mr. Donaldson's presentation, if we can go around and the participants just very briefly state your name and your affiliation, but any substantive comments we would hope you would reserve for later when we get to the questioning. Mr. Midgley.
Peter Midgley from Brigham Young University.
Brianna Schofield, I'm the Executive Director of Authors Alliance.
Heidi Tandy, I'm of counsel of the firm of Price Benowitz and here on behalf of the Organization for Transformative Works.
Hi, I'm Susan Miller. I'm a student attorney with the TLPC and representing Authors Alliance.
Blake Reed with the TLPC.
Jack Lerner, UC Irvine Intellectual Property Arts and Technology Clinic, here on behalf of both the ebook proponents and the film proponents.
Lauren Wertheimer, certified law student of the University of California, Irvine Law School.
Michael Donaldson, private practitioner with Donaldson and Califf, representing Film Independent, the International Documentary Association, Temkin, and UFVA.
Josh Welsh, president of Film Independent. I'm Jim Morissette, the Technical Director of Cartemquin Films, which is a 501c3 non-for-profit documentary film production company in Chicago, Illinois.
Patricia Aufderheide, Film Professor, American University.
I'm Matt Williams from Mitchell, Silberberg, and Knupp. I'm representing AAP, ESA, MPAA, and RIAA.
Bruce Turnbull, counsel for AACSLA.
David Taylor, counsel for DVD Copy Control Association.
All right, great. I think we'll start with Mr. Donaldson, if you can hopefully keep it to a few minutes, simply because we've got a lot of people who I'm sure have much to say, and we've got 2 hours to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just take a few minutes to respond to specific points that were made by opposing counsel. And the first one, since they made so much of the past use of the phrase documentary films at a time when we're seeking to cover all filmmakers, I need to plead guilty that back in 2009, when we first appeared before you, we only talked about documentary films, and at that point, it didn't make any difference, because frankly, films that were not categorized as documentary films were not using archival material. So you see in the 3 years previous, 0 in our office, 0 non-documentary projects. I first brought it up when we had various filmmakers and 3 projects in our office that we worked on. And for those that were at that hearing, I ended by saying I'll be back, because I didn't really expect Exemption. When it grew to 7, double the number, we made a serious try, and I think the Copyright Office thought seriously about it and tried to figure out some way to describe something less than all film. This past 3 years, we've worked on 65 films in the office that were not classified as documentary films and nevertheless used fair use, were insured, went out into the world. And if you project that, during the next 3 years, the bar will go all the way up to the writing. We stopped it at 109, but that's so conservative.
Can I just ask one question? Are those
Sure.
65 films that were released, or that your firm looked at for clearance issues?
We looked at for fair use. They were insured and released into the world.
Okay, and is that in the record what films they were?
I can provide. I can't give you a list off the top of my head, but I can supplement.
Okay, thanks.
One other follow-up question, because when we're talking about, you say that there are 65 films that were shown to be using fair use. The existing exemption for filmmaking that you're looking to expand talks about for purposes of comment and criticism. So are those films specifically constituting fair, like their use of motion picture clips? If it's constituting fair use, is it because they were for the purposes of comment and criticism?
Great question. I suspect the answer is not all of them. The exemption is much narrower than the fair use exemption as described by the courts. And that is the exemption we have to live with, and we're not asking for that to be expanded. We're willing to live with that over the next 3 years and see how it works, just as we have in the past. But it is narrower than the fair use exemption. But I wanted to also address the wildly inaccurate statement that has been injected into the record and was injected in the record last time by the MPA that, oh, if it's an entertaining film, it can't have fair use. Ridiculous and inaccurate reading of the case law. Fair use is for any kind of a film. And I start off with Jersey Boys, which was a wildly successful Broadway musical. A use of a clip in that show was found to be fair use. And when Warner Brothers made a film directed by Clint Eastwood that was actually more accurate than the musical because it showed the mafia. It's the guy with the glasses there. They used that same clip, and they used it pursuant to fair use. There it is. It's Ed Sullivan introducing the Four Seasons, as he said.
Mr. Johnson, just really quick, so in that case, though, the court did not look at that use for purposes of comment and criticism. It was specifically used to identify a significant part of the band's career, because you had like the British invasion at the time. And so, again, how is that example going to what the exemption is for, which is for purposes of comment and criticism?
What you're seeing and what I'm demonstrating is that more and more filmmakers, major filmmakers, independent filmmakers, are using archival footage, some pursuant to fair use, some that it does not fall within the fair use exception, licensed. This is a growing trend. We're in an era that people are starved for accurate information. It's everywhere. People are doubting what they're seeing and what they're hearing on the media. So filmmakers want to make sure the audiences understand when they're doing something that's accurate, that it is accurate, and they're using archival footage to do it. So the important point here is that this is a trend that nobody in this room will stop. Nobody can stop. It is filmmakers who want to use archival footage. And yes, the exemption is more narrow, and therefore you're going to see examples where, because the exemption wasn't available, there was no use trying to comply with the narrower view. It certainly could have been used as a with commentary if it gets expanded, and they're working with our office. We'll work with them as we work with them to bring it within fair use. We'll work with them to bring it within the exemption. And this is one that doesn't imply the DMCA at all, but it's an example. This was found to be fair use where Miramax Film copied the costume, the dialogue, and everything from a protected motion picture called Deep Throat, and they had to replicate the scenes with actors instead of using clips. And of course, way out in the entertainment spectrum is Midnight in Paris, where the Faulkner estate was sued, and the dialogue from Faulkner was found to be a fair use. And Midnight in Paris, a Woody Allen film, was clearly only entertainment. So this notion that has been injected into the record that entertaining films cannot have fair use is just ridiculous. I have sometimes these clips are used just because of money. This was a $4 million film, wonderful film. I'll provide you with a copy of the whole film because so much archival footage was used. It was about the overthrow of Pinochet, and a wonderful way they used, it was a $4 million film. They could not have replicated a 10,000 person scene, but they kept archival footage and actors, like in this scene, going back and forth. A marvelous film. Same with the Chavez film, which is another film we worked on. We worked on No. It was nominated for an Oscar. Chavez is a wonderful film that used actors, but Cesar Chavez's life was so amazing that they kept wanting to drop in archival footage to show that these events actually happened. And then another film we worked on, LBJ, Rob Reiner was the director. Woody Harrelson playing the president, wanted to show exactly what happened in Air Force One. This is the exact broadcast they watched as soon as President Johnson boarded the plane and before he was sworn in. Snowden, a film we talked about last time because we were working on it in the office. Oliver Stone worked so hard to make it accurate. You can see on the right the documentary that was shot of Snowden with his head under the blanket. And this is on the left, the way Oliver Stone set it up with an actor replicated the room, replicated the cloth over his head. Very accurate, and they had to use a lot of archival footage, and this is the exact footage that was being watched at the time. These are actors watching it because it's Snowden by Oliver Stone.
Can I ask, in these last few examples where there's archival footage, was that footage that was obtained on fair use but circumvention was not required, or that was obtained via a licensing arrangement?
That is a fair question to ask on all the films we worked on. And as to the films we worked on, I can tell you that it's my strong hunch that several of them just ripped a DVD to get the footage. And the reason I have to answer it that way is because when they're in the office, we give them a strong rundown. This is the exemption. This is the only way you can use it, and you can't use it except if you're going to label your film a documentary. So we get it back, and I'll ask the client, "Oh, that's great. Where did this come from?" And the answer I get is like, "We're not telling you. We're not going to." And so I don't know, but that answer suggests to me that I probably shouldn't know.
Well, it sounds like it's clear to you that they obtained an opinion of counsel, I guess, that it was likely to be fair use and perhaps insurance, and chose to proceed on a fair use basis as opposed to a licensing basis.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you too much more.
No, I don't mind being interrupted.
Wow.
I'm married. I know about being interrupted.
All right. Well, if you have a couple more minutes, and
Yeah.
then we'll start to
It
questioning.
also applies to music. Family Guy could not be anything but entertaining. And this was found to be fair use when he sings, instead of "I wish upon a star," "I wish for a Jew." He was looking for an accountant to clean his business up. Crown, this is interesting because in this very successful series, they're telling the Queen that her uncle, King Edward, actually went and cut a deal with Hitler. And people like me said, "What? I thought it was like a little much of literary license." They showed these actors, and I thought it was a little much. And then, probably anticipating that a lot of people felt that way, at the end, they showed a lot of archival footage of King Edward making nice in Russia, reviewing troops not in Russia, I'm sorry, in Germany with Hitler, and it gave confirmation to the point they were making earlier. Immediate Family, another entertaining film, found to be fair use. This appeared in the film quite a bit. And was found to be a fair use of this mobile, actually the animals on the mobile. Made in America, a film with Whoopi Goldberg, again, all entertainment. This was a picture, didn't implicate the DMCA, but that picture on the wall was found to be fair use. The exception is Rock. It's the only case I was able to find of a film not categorized as a documentary where something was found not to be fair use. And lo and behold, it was really a de minimis case. It was argued as a de minimis case, and they just kind of threw in fair use at the end. And of course, Universal made Steve Jobs and used fair use because they couldn't get this iconic advertisement. The family didn't like the content of the film. They didn't like the way Steve Jobs was represented, so they denied a license. And what you do by not expanding the exemption is that you turn copyright owners into censors. If they don't like a film, even though what they own can be licensed to many people, they're not going to license to you because they don't like the content of your film. This was the way Steve Jobs was pictured, they didn't like. And the same goes, by the way, for...
All right, we appreciate that. I think we will have questions, especially on the Steve Jobs example, but if you could wrap up just so we can start on some of the panelists.
I just want to let you know that I will be leaving behind 3 videos of some of those films, so that if you want to see the whole film the way it's worked, you'll be able to do that. Do you want me to take this out now?
I'll take care of it.
Okay, great,
Yep.
thanks. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
You can keep it, too.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Donaldson. So this actually dovetails into, how we're going to do it today for this panel is how we've done it this morning. And then yesterday is we're going to kind of have buckets of questions. So I know everybody has a lot to say. We will try to get to you. Just put up your placard like this if you want to be called on. And then we'll try and take everyone in turn. So as I alluded to, we're really talking about purposes for comment and criticism today in terms of expanding the existing exemptions for ebooks and for filmmaking. And the Register noted in her 2012 recommendation that the use of an earlier work to flesh out characters or motivations in a new work or to develop a storyline does not inherently serve the purpose of comment and criticism. And the opponents, and I think several of them noted this, and they cited that the examples that were cited by the proponents of both the ebooks and filmmaking exemption expansions did not constitute for purposes of comment and criticism. So my first question would be to the ebooks people and to the filmmakers, what is your best example of in the case of ebooks, like a fiction multimedia ebook that is used for purposes of comment and criticism? All right, Ms. Tandy.
Rather than go into something that actually already exists, I'd like to talk about this in the context of something that would like to exist but doesn't. Right now, it's possible for people to take content from a DVD or a Blu-ray or from an online download and rip it and turn it into a fan vid because we've already gone through that exemption purpose. However, the minute somebody wants to take that content and turn it into, say, not a multiplayer game, but some sort of a linear like a choose-your-own-adventure style story in the format of a game using Twine, or if they want to turn it into an ebook that is either non-downloadable or downloadable that includes different kinds of content, i.e. video content, but also screenshot stills, things that are created, something they may have filmed for themselves either locally or at a fan convention or something like that. The minute they want to weave all of that together into one unitary work that is not a video that you can upload to YouTube or upload to Vimeo, that's where the exemption ends. So if you want to do this in a video form so that you have, say, for example, one screen and there's a video and the video plays and then some text flashes up on the screen, someone can either pause to read it or you've got enough, time so that somebody can read it and then it goes, then it goes to another video.
To understand, is your concern that the remix video exemption language would sort of bleed over into being an ebook if it's a video and then text, or maybe I'm not understanding?
If it's entirely in one video file, then it would constitute. But if you wanted it to be something that's available in a different kind of media format, then the exemption wouldn't go that far. Say, for example, I wanted text, and if I click on this part of the text, it goes to this video, and if I click on this part of a text, it goes to a different kind of a video. Sort of in an ebook format, the exemption as it currently exists doesn't cover that unless it's something that I can see as a single, AVI file.
All right, and are you speaking purely in the realm of the remix video exemption is currently enacted, requires it to be non-commercial, and I understand the ebooks exemption does not have a similar limitation. Are you talking about in the realm of non-commercial videos or non-commercial ebooks?
Well, the question about commercial versus non-commercial is very weird because there isn't any sort of a stable and perfect definition of what is or isn't commercial. Earlier this week, Hasbro introduced basically a terms of use for people who want to create content inspired by or based on Hasbro properties. And they say very specifically in it that if you have a Patreon or if you have, people can buy you a coffee online or give you PayPal money for doing your content in general, they don't consider that commercial. But obviously, some other entity might not have that exact same definition of commercial. So for the definition of commerciality, I'm trying to leave that out of the conversation here because we don't have a perfect definition of it.
Okay, I think it would be hard from the Copyright Office perspective to say commerciality is irrelevant to fair use.
But what's the definition of commerciality? If you have something on a website like LiveJournal that has advertisements on it for people who do not have paid accounts, or if you have something that is available via Google Play, where there are ads on the side column that Google puts there and you're not getting any revenue from it, is that commercial or is that non-commercial?
I don't want to get away from the fiction, nonfiction element. I think maybe some of that might be relevant to the next panel, but I would invite others to speak to the question you raised as to how to figure out if something is commercial or not, because I think that the case law might be helpful there.
Agreed.
But so specifically, are there examples of ebooks that want to be created, that cannot be created, that are, because of TPMs, that are specifically for the purpose of comment and criticism?
Just having watched discussions by people, the Organization for Transformative Works, and other entities that I'm involved with that are on the interactive games and interactive ebook side of things, I think that there are things that people want to create that include either mise-en-scène or just to flesh out a narrative or to give an example or to show something that happened in the past, who would like to be able to incorporate those kinds of clips. And in part right now, the technology is not necessarily available for it to happen particularly easily, but it is getting there. And to be able to do that sort of thing, both on a tablet or on a computer and within the next couple years in virtual reality, I think is something that people want to be able to do.
Sure. I think the Copyright Office, what we really need to see are concrete examples, because we can't really evaluate fair use in a vacuum, or and there were a few examples that were given in the record, but if you could maybe talk about, or someone else, or Filmmaking wants to jump in, but what is your best example that the Copyright Office can look at to see that there are in fact people who want to create fiction, multimedia ebooks for the purposes of comment and criticism?
I put one into, as I think you all have seen, into my prepared remarks or my submission statement. And it basically focuses on the idea using the TV show Supernatural, which is about to go into its 14th season, so it's basically the longest running U.S. genre show so far. In that show, in the fictional world created in that show, there is a series of novels called the Supernatural series. My proposal was for a group of fans in that world creating a YouTube series, and within that YouTube series the process that they go to in creating this particular fan work, and going through discussions of, can I do this in fan fiction, can I do this in my fan art, and whether or not I'm able to get into this kind of creative genre. So it would use clips from the show to illustrate things that fans themselves were creating. And the only way to do that as an ebook would be, basically the only way to do it now legitimately would be to do it as a video, and it wouldn't have the same presence of being able to sort of scroll through the experience of being within that fandom. Whereas creating it as an ebook, something that people can download as a Kindle file or download as a specific PDF file or a different kind of a format, would give them the ability to have it as an ebook, and it would have a different visual and personalizable experience to be able to go through it.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. So why is circumvention of TPMs necessary to create such a book?
Because in order to create the fan content that would be created within this kind of a project, I would need to be able to go to the show itself and to some of the behind-the-scenes images that are in the DVDs that have been released by Warner Brothers in connection with the show, and pull those different elements out to put into the ebook that I'd like to create for this.
And so why wouldn't screen capture be a feasible alternative?
Because a screen capture would be a static element. And to be able to have multiple static elements would look weird compared to the other content that I'd be creating within this, whereas having something with the proper flow, especially if I was able to do this in a virtual reality mode in the next year or two, you wouldn't be able to see it properly on the screen. Have you ever been to like a wedding or something like that where there's a video on the screen and the pictures are floating across the screen, you know, like in the slideshows that you have like at engagement parties and weddings, and then all of a sudden there's a clip and it's completely static and your brain wants that image to move. Your brain expects that image to be floating across the screen or some sort of a frame to manifest around it, and it stutters your brain to be able to see it as something that's completely static on the screen in the middle of all this video. That's why when we're watching newscasts, they usually have some sort of emotion on the screen because that's what your brain is used to seeing.
And why wouldn't it be possible to license if screen capture is not?
Well,
feasible alternative?
for larger scale shows like this, the powers that be, i.e. the owners of the copyright, don't necessarily have the time or the energy to devote for somebody to be able to communicate with the millions of fans who want to create fan works. Sometimes you have a situation like Hasbro where they finally say, okay, you can do all of these different things. And in that kind of a situation, you have a blanket license to be able to do it. Even going back to like 2002, when America Online worked out a deal with Warner Brothers and you could finally use Harry Potter, for example, house crests as your user picture on America Online. But to be able to get to that point, even for something that's a large-scale show, is something that takes many, many years and a lot of dollars and a lot of time and a lot of effort from within the company itself. Some companies don't want to do it. Some companies don't have the time to do it. But also, some companies can't make that kind of a turnaround very, very quickly. So if I want to do something that's commenting on a show that's recent, like with The Simpsons last week, because there had been an extensive discussion of quote-unquote the problem with Apu, one of the characters on the show, and then The Simpsons finally addressed it. And if I wanted to be able to create an ebook that responded to that quickly, then I would want to be able to get it out immediately. And even if I only had to wait one full business day, then I wouldn't be able to get it up Sunday night. I'd have to wait till Tuesday.
Thank you. I wonder if anyone, perhaps Mr. Williams, not to put you on the spot, wants to speak, but I guess I just did, as to whether your clients are in the license for fan works, whether they would do so for commercial purpose, whether they would offer licenses to use archival footage for mise en scène, as Ms. Tandy said, and then we'll go to Ms. Schofield.
Thank you. I missed one thing that you were saying, licensed archival footage, and then I missed.
I think Ms. Tandy suggested one of the reasons why I think fan work creators and others wish to use material is to set the mise en scène for a larger creative work that they're making.
Okay. So I think you were asking a couple of times for examples that involved criticism and commentary, and I haven't really heard that yet. I'm not sure what the criticism or commentary is. I did review the comments, and I did go on to a number of the platforms and try to watch some of the remix videos, for lack of a better word. Some of them have decent fair use arguments that I can actually perceive from watching them without an explanation. Others, to me, do not appear to be non-infringing uses. I do think my clients are open to licensing, if that was your question, and some of my clients have made public statements about the types of uses that even though they might be infringing, they're not going to object to or they're not going to take action on. But when it comes to, is there a market for licensing the clips, then yes, there is. If what she's saying is it's not good enough if she can't get it within one business day, that would be a difficult standard to meet.
I think she's laid out a couple of obstacles, and one obstacle is that the studios or other copyright holders just might not be wanting to deal with, I guess, an individual remixer or someone small who may not have a lot of money to pay for it. I don't know if that is paraphrasing, but for the FanWorks community general, are there licenses available to them if they need it, or is there a sort of agreement that it's fair or not going to be actionable?
I don't think there's any general agreement that all works that would be described as fan fiction are non-infringing. We've got some cases in our opposition at page 15 involving things like kind of unauthorized prequels or sequels to different works, and those have been held to be infringing. I don't think there's any cases in the record on fan works being non-infringing. So I'm not saying that they are always infringing, and as I said, I think there probably are some out there that are not, that I've seen.
But do you know if there's licensing? It sounds like you're not necessarily disagreeing with how Ms. Tandy has characterized the availability of licenses.
I don't think there's any record showing that my clients are unwilling to issue licenses to individuals, and I'm pretty sure in the last record that there was testimony from Fox that they would issue such licenses. What the cost of those licenses would be and whether someone could afford it is a different question. I don't know exactly what the price would be, and it would differ from studio to studio. Sometimes they might issue no-cost licenses. They do that frequently in the education space, and it might be possible they do that in this space. But I haven't seen anything in the record to indicate that someone came to one of my clients and was denied a license.
Okay, Ms. Schofield?
Thanks. This is Brianna Schofield. So I would like to offer a couple more examples about where criticism and commentary may be offered, but in the nonfiction space, in ways that is questionable as to whether the limitation that the use must be for offering film analysis.
I'm sorry, you're going to give nonfiction examples or fiction examples?
Nonfiction examples that go beyond using the material potentially for film analysis. So speaking to that side of the modification that we're requesting.
Got it. Understood. Thank you.
So the first is an example of a book called Show Sold Separately, which is by Jonathan Gray. This book is a book that critiques the phenomenon of how audiences are interacting with movies and TV shows based on preconceived notions before that material is released. So by looking at promotional material, media coverage, trailers, and whatnot to really comment upon how the audience is interacting with that work prior to the release of that work. This book is available online. It uses video clips and other images embedded in the ebook that really help the audience for that book understand the author's argument. The other example is actually in our comment, which is Digital Dubliners. This is another multimedia ebook, which is a guide to James Joyce's book, The Dubliners, and it uses film clips and other still images to provide historical and cultural context, and again aids the reader's understanding by using that material, commenting on it in order to fully flesh out Joyce's book, The Dubliners. So in my opinion, that these examples show that the limitation to books offering film analysis is potentially too stifling. At best, authors have uncertainty that surrounds their project as to whether the film, the limitation to film analysis would actually apply to their works, and at worst, they may abandon their projects because of that uncertainty.
So in the examples that you just gave, were the motion picture clips, were they licensed? It was like how were they used in the ebooks?
I don't have firsthand knowledge about how that worked.
Thank you. I think Mr. Reed was next.
Thank you. This is Blake Reed, and I want to tee up Ms. Miller to speak to some of the fair use issues that Mr. Williams just raised. But very quickly, I wanted to raise a legal point, which is that the office has already made determinations or presumptive determinations in this proceeding to renew both the non-commercial video exemption and the multimedia ebook exemption offering film analysis. And I'm a little concerned that some of this discussion feels like an effort to relitigate some of the record that has already been accepted by the office and has not been opposed by opponents. So in particular, the notion of seeking seeking out licenses as a viable non-circumventing alternative in both the non-commercial video exemption and in the nonfiction multimedia ebooks exemption. The only requirement is, I think it's in sort of the subparagraph B of both exemptions, is that the person who's engaging in the circumvention reasonably believes that there's not a non-circumventing alternative available. So I think the burden that Mr. Williams is attempting to impose here, the idea that we need to have a lengthy record of folks reaching out, seeking out a license for every single clip, I think that goes beyond the requirement that's already in these exemptions. And as I recall, Mr. Williams and his clients did not object to the renewal of those exemptions nor the acceptance of the record that led to them. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't relitigate that point. I also wanted to just very briefly put a finer point on what Ms. Tandy said, which is she's describing a non-commercial video in her Supernatural project that would pretty clearly fall under the ambit of the non-commercial video exemption. And the idea is there are a number of projects in that vein where it would make sense, rather than to sort of enshrine those on a YouTube channel or something like that and distribute them as videos, it would actually make more sense from a creative perspective to embed them in an ebook. So I think what we're talking about, just to sort of clarify, and maybe this gets to the broader questions about whether a unitary class 1 that encompasses all of these sorts of uses might make sense, is taking a video that would be within the ambit of the non-commercial video exemption and distributing it in the form of an ebook. So I just wanted to offer that as a clarification.
Well, I guess my follow-up question is, like, so say the Register Award to recommend an expansion, we'll talk about ebooks, I mean, similarly for, but so say what if there were to be a limitation for non-commercial use, but it was extended to fiction, but it was for non-commercial purposes. Would that be reasonable?
Well, let me just point out, again, the office has already recommended accepting the ebook, the multimedia ebook exemption, which doesn't have a non-commercial.
That's right, but what
piece to it.
I'm specifically asking, though, like if we were to extend it to fiction, which it does not currently cover, would it be reasonable at the same time to add a limitation limiting it to non-commercial use?
So just to make sure I understand the question, the idea would be expanding the exemption in a way that would cover fictional ebooks, perhaps offering non-film analysis or some combination of fictional and non-film analysis, but only in a commercial context.
In the non-commercial
Excuse me, only in a non-commercial context.
But yes, otherwise, yes.
So, I think I'll defer to some of my colleagues here to speak to commerciality. I think, obviously that's better than what we have now, and that would expand the abilities for authors and bidders to make use of the platform. I think the question that the office had to be grappling with is, to the point that Ms. Smith raised, how that impacts the fair use analysis. And I think there's a good case to be made that there are still some legitimate fair uses out there that might fall within the ambit of commerciality, but I might defer to my colleague, Professor Lerner, to address that in more depth.
Well, I would thank you, Jack Lerner. I would also add to what Mr. Reed is saying. The problem is that what you're saying is you're welcome to make fair use, you're welcome to exercise your speech, you're welcome to make criticism and commentary, but if you want to do this as a living or to supplement your living, or if you want to use that incentive to actually go out and create, you wouldn't be able to do that. That prospect would not be permitted. And as we've seen and many courts have held, commercial use is not in itself a bar to fair use. In fact, the vast majority of fair use is commercial use in the sense that it's and I'm not talking about being placed up on YouTube where there are ads being displayed, but actually, taking your film to market or whatever it may be. Many ebooks that make fair use are sold in marketplaces, digital marketplaces, and so on. So I would say what you'd be doing there would really be taking the incentive away from a large group of creators.
I think Mr. Williams and Ms. Miller.
Thank you. So there's just been a number of mischaracterizations of our position, and I'm going to try to clean some of them up. what Blake was just saying, that I was arguing that every single thing in the record has to involve someone going and seeking a license and being denied. That's not at all what I was saying. What I was saying was that if you're going to use as part of your reasoning the notion that my clients are unwilling to license in order to justify the exemption, there should be some evidence of that fact, and there simply isn't as far as I'm aware. So that's number one. We do believe licensing is important as an option, but that wasn't what I was saying, that every single example in the record, that needs to be part of what transpired. Going back to what Mr. Donaldson said in his presentation, his whole premise was that our position is that you can never make fair use in an entertaining motion picture, and that's absolutely not the case. And we say that expressly in our comments. So I'm not sure if he didn't read them or if that was a rhetorical device, but the MPAA often asserts fair use. The MPAA makes entertaining films. We say expressly in our filing that we are not claiming you can never make fair use in an entertaining film. However, it's a murky area, much murkier than the issues we're dealing with film analysis or with a documentary film. And the record has always been that there are no good examples, or maybe one or two here and there, of fictional works that involve the need to make clips included and that are clear fair uses, especially in the commercial context. And so to get to an exemption, that is the standard that needs to be met, that there's a large amount of fair use out there that's being suppressed, and that standard has never been met, and I don't think it's been met here today. So I just wanted to clarify that. A number of the cases that are cited by the other side, my clients are the defendants, so we're not here to take an anti-fair use position, but this is about when you can get an exemption in this proceeding and when you cannot. Another thing that's raised a number of times is, well, we have a low budget here. I don't think that gets you to a fair use conclusion. Under the fourth factor, if there's a market that's established or a potential market and the copyright owner is out there exploiting it or on the verge of exploiting it or likely to exploit it, then there is harm, regardless of whether an individual user says they can't afford within the budget for their work to get a license. And so I don't think that is a justification for an exemption. There were a large number of films discussed by Mr. Donaldson, and I'd be happy to go through them one by one, but I know you're short on time, so I'll take questions on that.
Ms. Miller?
Hi, I just wanted to kind of go back to the criticism and commentary aspect of the fictional works that we kind of began this discussion with, and talking about Heidi Tandy's example again. And when we're talking about a fictional work and how it can be a fair use and how her work is a critique, it's a critique of the characters, which involves also critiquing society as a whole oftentimes. And the story that she proposes is commenting on specific characters and specific elements that has a broader scope. And that is just one of our examples. Obviously, there are other works out there that have a similar aspect, and that is one of the trends of fan fiction, is that they often critique and comment on society as a whole, even though they're using characters from a well-known work, or they're using a minor character in a certain way. They are often critiquing in a grander scale.
I think that's the issue, whether it needs to critique and comment upon the work itself in order to affect under the first factor, and then also how the fourth factor might be impacted the market for derivatives versus making a broader commentary about society. I don't think we question that, almost any creative work is going to do the latter.
Right.
But we're looking for specific examples of criticism and commentary of the copyrighted work that the circumvention is, taking place in order to use.
All right. I'll let Heidi speak. I think she may have more to say on her work specifically, but I'll also just throw in the non-commerciality aspect of fictional works, and specifically fan fiction. It is a trend, and it's very common amongst fan fiction authors not to sell their works. It is a non-commercial work of art, and so that is something that is very common amongst the fandom.
It is, though Mr. Reed said that that would not be a reasonable limitation to impose. So how do we reconcile that?
I'll be happy to jump in. I think the question, and Professor Lerner raised this, there are different communities that are affected by the ambit of this exemption. So the fan fiction community, broadly construed, and Ms. Tandy can speak to that more directly, is one of them. But we're talking about an exemption that affects lots of different communities on the internet that are interested or may be interested in taking advantage of this. And some of those communities, to the point that Mr. Lerner raised, might look at their ability to recoup the expenses of developing what is likely to be a fairly intensive in terms of time and resources project, and being able to recoup some of those. And again, our perspective is the office should be looking at these questions under the traditional four-factor fair use analysis. And I think we've described in our briefing, and we don't need to get into too deep in the weeds unless you'd like, that commerciality is not necessarily a barrier to fair use. Having said all of that, again, we would, if the office were to draw this exemption in a way that it swept in non-commercial ebook use for non-film analysis or our fictional works, that would be an improvement over what we have now.
Okay, thank you. Just Ms. Miller, Ms. Tandy, very briefly, because I would like to get to the filmmakers also. So please go ahead.
So I just wanted to speak very briefly on the issue of fan fiction and fan works and fan videos. Basically, any form of fan creativity is commentary and criticism. Fan fiction and fan art derived basically not just in the 1960s when Star Trek fandom started to explode, but even going further back to, say, people doing Sherlock Holmes fan fiction or Alice in Wonderland fan fiction in the 1900s and the 19-teens. People like Frances Hodgson Burnett were creating fan works for, and she went on to write The Secret Garden and The Little Princess, were writing fan fiction in those universes and sharing it amongst their friends, and that was really how they started writing and commenting on the Sherlock Holmes stories. So it was a way to talk about the stories and the characters themselves, and yes, there was, different parameters that they were putting in with regard to society, but it's inherently commenting on the story itself, because if what you wanted in fan fiction was already in the story, then you wouldn't need to write it separately. However, there's something missing, or there's something you're not seeing, or there's something that you want to give different kind of illumination to. And if that's what you're seeing in the story that is missing, then that's what you want to create. And that doesn't necessarily mean only illuminating a minor character or only writing a missing scene, because it's just a different perspective.
I appreciate that, and again, we've found that many instances of fan works are likely to be fair use, but the way you're describing it now seems to also encompass a lot of derivative work examples. Where would you draw the line, or how do you see the derivative?
Well, I can see situations where cosplay, for example, is not necessarily making a comment on the characters themselves or on the story itself, but it can be. Let's say, for example, you want to recategorize the entire Justice League if it was in a steampunk universe, or if it was, in a solar punk universe. Then the costumes and the content and the structure that you're creating there as cosplay would be different. But that's not what we're specifically speaking about here in terms of this exemption. So focusing specifically on what you'd want to be creating in an ebook or in a game that can be presented as an ebook, in those kinds of situations, it's inherently a commentary on the work itself, especially if it's an ebook where people are being given choices where they can decide which direction the story is going to go, or how they're going to read the story, what part they're going to click on first, what part they're going to view and enjoy first. And that's how it differs, especially in a multimedia ebook, from just something that's a standard text-only story that you're reading on the screen. But those kinds of things, say, for example, creating in-universe content, like I remember back in 2003, 2004, people were creating Wizarding magazine pages, like what you would see in a magazine in the Harry Potter universe. And, with ads for brooms and with different kinds of, household spells, but also articles about, 5 different uses for flu powder and stuff like that. And they were creating it in a way that would look like a magazine page if it were in the Wizarding world. And that kind of thing is a commentary on the story without even getting into any of the individual characters, without taking quotes from the story that mashes up the text and also the photographs of it. Now, in 2003, we didn't really have the technology to be able to create and share moving images online the same way that we do now. So somebody who wanted to do something similar to that now would want to be able to create it as an ebook multimedia format.
Thank you. And, okay, so I know the filmmakers have been patiently waiting. Ms. Ofterheide? I'm so sorry if I butchered your name.
It's all good. So I just want to make a really simple point that it doesn't seem to me to, I think you can make a distinction between documentary and fiction. I hope you can, because I wrote a whole book about documentary film. But that's one of many ways to slice that unitary form. So it seems to me this is a form that shares virtually everything between those two categories. You're talking about using audio and video together. You're talking about long form and short form. You're talking about 3-act structure. You're talking about using reenactments in both cases. So these aesthetic forms are all very similar, and many kinds of documentary and many kinds of fiction don't make commentary and criticism about anything else, and then sometimes they do. So, and then you have these hybrids, like Active Killing is a major award-winning film in which the characters, the documentary characters, are reenacting. They are real-life people in Indonesia who see themselves as gangsters and dream of being gangsters in a gangster movie and then stage a gangster movie. Now, this is something where there are no gangster movies referenced in there. And I'm sure, I think it is very hard to say, here's a great example of how this is done when people know that they can't do it. That they can't add this stuff without enormous complications. And although Mr. Williams says that it's not difficult to license, I assure you, as somebody who has worked with documentary filmmakers for 40 years, the complaints never stop about not getting answers back from license holders about the requests for licensing. So I do think that there's examples of hybrid films like Active Killing where you could imagine a perfectly plausible use of material like a gangster movie to comment on. It isn't hard to take a category like music video and think of Beyonce's Lemonade as referring to many things in the real world critically, and being a criticism about the role of African Americans in society, and in the slighting of African American culture. I don't think it's hard to see parody and satire and those fiction skits that are on Saturday Night Live every weekend as examples where incorporating and referring to and criticizing and creating commentary on real copyrighted things is something that there's no reason not to encourage. Good Night and Good Luck, a film that, like many biopics in historical films, has, I think, there's just no reason to say we want to discourage somebody from showing what we mean by a vast wasteland and so on. But my argument is basically this is a form in which you can there's no reason to say it's just crazy to think of criticism and commentary happening in a fiction universe. This is a unitary form. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I will say the last rulemaking, we tried to look at, so we're not trying to make any aesthetic judgments as to whether criticism and commentary can or cannot happen in a non-fictional work or in a fictional work. We're trying to look at when there is a use of a copyrighted work, whether it is likely to be non-infringing. And in the filmmaking context, there had been enough record to say that for documentary films, it was likely to be non-infringing. And we are asked to sort of push that boundary further now to all filmmaking. And the last rulemaking, we said, well, because we understand there's also many other uses of copyrighted works that may implicate the derivative, right? Or may be validly licensed. It may not be the examples you're talking about. But in terms of a line drawing exercise, we floated whether biopic would sort of make sense to push out to, and I think everyone thought that was unsatisfactory. So if you had any thoughts as to how we might describe it, or whether that is just a fruitless project to draw any division between types of films, to separate out ones where use of a copyrighted work is likely to be non-infringing for those where it is likely to be infringing.
And maybe just jumping on that, one way to think about it might be to say, rather than extending the exemption to cover specific films, maybe there's a way to exclude certain types of films which might be less likely to be fair use in your answer.
So this is something that I don't quite understand. I perhaps don't understand what your task is, because it really seems to me like it's pretty. You're being pretty clear. Commentary and criticism of the thing itself. So wouldn't it be up to the person to make sure that they color within the lines, and if they don't, they pay the penalty? And obviously, there are going to be many circumstances in which that's not going to fit, and they are going to have to go license. But I don't understand what's the bad part about letting people have that option of using that in a form in which you've already said, well, one part of the form it's fine. But to me, there's both fuzziness at the edges between these forms. And also, it seems to me, no reason to not extend it to the whole form. It seems almost arbitrary to me. Because if the there are also lots of situations in a documentary film where it would be infringing to use copyrighted material and that's why filmmakers like Jim Morset's outfit, they have something on our website where they show all the clips they licensed and all the clips they didn't license, and the reasons why in that film Refrigerator Mothers. Because there's lots of reasons why. Anyway, never mind.
I was going to ask if that evidence is in the record anywhere. I think that would actually be a useful document.
Which evidence?
How you reference Mr. Morset's film, or how.
Yeah, we can give you that link.
Some uses were fair use and some were licensed, some were not. I think that would be a helpful submission. I know Mr. Lerner has had his placard up for a while, but I do want to kind of go to Mr. Williams and Mr. Taylor just to hear kind of what your position is relative, like if we were to go ahead and extend the filmmaking exemption to include films, but for the purposes of comment and criticism, like why is that not sufficient to ensure that you're more on the fair use side of things?
And I'm going to speak to ebooks as well, if that's okay, because that's why I had my my placard up. Of course, comment and criticism is an important aspect of the analysis when you're dealing with fair use. It's a lot harder to see how that plays out in the fictional context than it does in the documentary context. And because the examples that we've been hearing about are things like, needing to use archival footage to show what it was like to be in the moment at a certain point in history. That's not commenting on that footage, it's using it to further a different purpose. So yes, that would need to be a necessary piece of any exemption if there was an expansion, but I don't think it gets you to a point where you can be comfortable enough that it's always going to be fair use and that an exemption is justified without some specific examples that you can wrap your hands around, that you can apply the 4 factors to, and that you can determine whether what's at issue is really criticism and commentary, number 1, and number 2, whether even if it is, there would be some market harm. The example in the ebook context that I heard earlier was, I want to write a fan fiction ebook that is a choose-your-own-adventure style approach. And so if I understand that correctly, that would be taking, say, a movie character, writing your own novel about that character, and then taking clips from some of the movies that have been made and inserting them along the way so that the reader can say, oh, well, I'm going to make this choice, and therefore I now watch this piece of the movie, and then the novel moves on. I haven't heard anything about how that involves criticism or commentary of the movie itself. It may involve some type of additional expression that's in the new novel, but the Axanar case and the Salinger case, I mean, the courts have not held that such uses are fair. The other thing that was raised is it enough to just say, well, it's all non-commercial ebooks or non-commercial fictional films, and I don't think that is enough. Just the fact that something isn't for sale doesn't mean that it's, number one, non-commercial for fair use purposes, because paying the customary price is what is involved in that analysis, not just whether you sell it for a profit. And so there could be all kinds of uses that are non-commercial that would still harm my clients and that would still be infringing uses. So without the specific examples, I'm not seeing it. The examples I did see, and I won't rehash all of the examples that Mr. Donaldson went through, but there were a very small number where he said, okay, in this scene, in this fictional film, because we were trying to show what happened on Air Force One right after Kennedy was shot, we had to show the actual footage those people watched. Maybe that's a justification that you really have to have that specific piece of footage to accurately recreate the fictional scene. That's not criticism and commentary on that footage. And in most of the cases that he referenced, for example, the Cesar Chavez film, which I watched recently, I think there were a wide variety of archival clips that they could have chosen from, and they selected the ones that they wanted the most, and there was a list of credits at the end where either they had licensed or they had been given gratis licenses from a number of entities. I think that, if I recall, included NBC Universal, and there may have been some where they decided to try to make fair use, but if it was actually fair use, I don't know, because if you've got 60 clips of Cesar Chavez to choose from and you pick the one that's the most engaging because the people who created it did a great job, the fact that you don't want to pay to license that one, I'm not sure that that's fair use.
I have a lot of follow-up, but I know lots of people have their placards up, so Mr. Taylor.
David Taylor. I think the problem is that there are no real concrete examples throughout this. What we've heard is, particularly in the ebook situation, is stuff that sounds more like interactive games. And it's not clear to me that, that is an ebook. And so I'm not exactly sure what the examples are. And the examples that we've seen in the filmmaking examples are their archival clips. Well, the archival clips, as far as I know, aren't distributed on protected DVDs. Those are news clips that you have to get from some other source. So again, we don't see examples of use that we can actually evaluate to say this is clearly a non-infringing use or not. So I think that's all I have.
Okay, I know Mr. Lerner and Mr. Reed have had their placards up, but I am interested into hearing more specific examples, if there are any, from the filmmakers that go to basically what the opponents have just said. Like, they don't see like there are sufficient examples in the record showing for the purposes of comment and criticism, so I would be particularly interested to hear about that, and then what other points you have. Mr. Lerner or Mr.
Thank you. I'll probably have to supply a supplemental. I wasn't the point person on a couple films that did come to my mind that were worked on since the last hearing in our office. One was a wonderful film called In Search of Fellini, where it was a young woman very taken with Fellini's work, and the actual clips were shown for the purpose, commenting on them, that this is the power of a Fellini film, which is very unusual. I see one of the panelists nodding her head, which, if you haven't seen the Fellini films, you wouldn't particularly relate to how impactful they are. And recreating them as they did in Lovelace doesn't work. You really have to see what Fellini did. The other one was a a film, a scripted film, about Christine, who is an news anchor in Florida, who one night on the news leaned down, pulled out a gun, and shot herself. Using anything but that is so the commentary is this is how it looked to the television audience that day, not something cooked up as a redo as they did in Lovelace, but this is what the audience actually saw. In that case, I'm not sure if they decided they couldn't because it was not within the exemption and they couldn't get it otherwise. It's certainly not footage that the television station is licensing. I did want to comment before I passed on to Jack that you implied that I was suggesting low budget was somehow part of the consideration when you're making a fair use analysis, and of course it is not. But what it is, it tells you that there is this group of people based on budget who simply can't afford $10,000 a clip for a number of clips in a film where they're used for criticism and comment, which again is much narrower than just fair use. When I hear the words, well, I'm not personally satisfied, to me that's not particularly relevant, nor is it particularly relevant that I am personally satisfied. It's the fact that you have insurance companies who put real skin in the game, take a real risk of hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'll say, we'll defend that. And that is not lightly taken. We all know insurance companies don't like to play claims. And, most of us had experience with that. Insurance companies are taking on a major risk every time they insure one of these films that contains fair use.
So do you have any examples of insurance companies refusing to insure a movie because they are fearful of like a motion picture clip being incorporated, and they say that basically we're looking for adverse effects here. So do you have any specific examples where a movie's not made because the insurer said, no, if you cannot use that movie clip?
I have several examples. Again, I think I need to do it in writing so I can check with the point person on the film, where adjustments have been made. Every film we've worked on, we've eventually gotten insurance, but quite often there's pushback from the underwriter, and not so much disagreeing with our analysis, but rather that person's very litigious. Films, we have a number of films dealing with the current president, and the insurance companies are very strict about that because they are concerned about a litigious person being at the center of the film. So we've had a lot of pushback, more on the risk factor than the fair use factor, but I can get some examples to you, but I want to be accurate about it, not just like, oh, this is the way things are.
Great, thank you. Mr. Lerner?
Thank you, Jack Lerner. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the definition of criticism and commentary. I think it's been dealt with by some of my fellow proponents here, but the definition of criticism and commentary does not, or when you make criticism and commentary, it's not necessary to say explicitly, I am commenting on this work, I am criticizing this work, and here is exactly what I'm saying. It can be, as Mr. Donaldson said, simply showing how someone felt about a work at the time, right? And that's absolutely a commentary and criticism of the work. But also, why is criticism and commentary limited to criticism and commentary of a specific work that has not been in the definition before? I also want to just counter something. There are a number of cases that support the contention that many fan fictions are fair use. I would just point the register to SunTrust versus Houghton Mifflin, which was about an unauthorized parody/sequel of Gone with the Wind. And there are a number of other cases which we're happy to submit in the record. I want to make the point that you've already endorsed in the non-commercial bidder exemption, which you've suggested or said that you will be suggesting for renewal, an exemption that includes fictional use. A couple of other quick points on this question about the sufficiency of the use and criticism and commentary, and the question of whether fiction or non-documentary films should be included. Let's be clear. I don't think there's any question at this point after I think we've had exemptions in place in the documentary context for 8 years. I don't think there's any question after all these years that there's a real risk of any kind of infringement or of any kind of quote-unquote piracy that would arise if you simply remove the term documentary from the existing exemption. The effect would be lifting a veil of fear and a chilling effect, and there would be absolutely no effect on the market that our friends at the end of the table are concerned about.
Do you contend that the licensing market would not be affected? Do you think that if someone, do you want to speak to that?
Absolutely, yes. The licensing market would not be affected because what we're talking about is the market for works which a rights holder has the right to demand a license for. If I make fair use and I do it appropriately, as our clients do, a rights holder does not have the right to say you need a license to that. What we have now is that we have a number of filmmakers who are either not doing the fair use that they want to do, or they're getting licenses simply because they can't access the material they want to access. And I don't think there's really any dispute that there is a large amount of fair use in the non-documentary context. Right? The question is how much of that is being licensed when it actually doesn't need to be licensed.
Are there any examples you can point us to, especially in the written comments, of something where a license was taken because of Section 1201, but otherwise you believe would not have been taken because it would have been non-infringing under 107?
Could you repeat the question? Whether a license has been taken because of...
Examples where a work is licensed for use because of Section 1201, but, in a world where Section 1201 is not applicable, it would not be necessary to obtain a license because fair use would permit the unlicensed use.
There are numerous examples in the record. We brought forth we've brought forth in the last 2 rulemakings, I think, nearly 70 different films where people said, I want to make fair use, but I can't because of the DMCA's restrictions. A number of these did include licenses. We could supplement the record with some specific examples. And finally, I just want to point the office to something that the Register said in 2015 at page 78 of her recommendation. She explicitly noted that she did not need to opine on the fairness of any particular proposed use, and that the standard is simply many of the contemplated uses are likely to be non-infringing under Section 107. And we think that we have shown that with a lot of documentary evidence, and this evidence is undisputed in the sense that, well, they're saying that it's not fair use, and we're saying that it is. But at the same time, there's no real dispute that a broad, robust, burgeoning fair use practice is existing in the non-documentary context. And the question is whether a lot of this will be either chilled or whether a lot of this will be allowed to go forward without that, without Section 1201 being an impediment.
So many questions I want to ask. Mr. Reed?
Sure, and I just want to, Blake Reed, just want to tag on to what Professor Lerner said and respond to some comments that Mr. Williams made. Ms. Chavez, we understand that the office, this job would be a lot easier for the office if we could arrive with a binder full of business plans and scripts and ideas that folks had gotten all lined up and ready to go, but for the existence of Section 1201, and had asked permission and had satisfied to all of the questions that you've asked today, that they would go forward were this exemption not granted. But we want to remind the office of the context in which this rulemaking is taking place. First of all, this rulemaking takes place every 3 years, and it currently is against the backdrop of Section 1201, which makes the creation of these films, where licensing and screen capture are not reasonable alternatives, which, as we've argued at length, they're not, it basically makes making these films illegal. And it makes them punishable by statutory damages. It makes them punishable where it's willful and commercial by criminal prosecution. So you have to understand that folks are maybe not willing to come out of the woodworks with very detailed plans and say, when we get our shot in 3 years, we are willing to provide this incredibly detailed record.
Professor Reed, I just have to interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
We appreciate that, but because we are tasked with every 3 years looking at whether the market has changed, the proposed uses have changed, we do need to tie it to some real-world examples of what people like to do. And in the past, we have been able to do that for a variety of audiovisual uses, and that's what we're looking to do. It is difficult for the office to say, without looking at some tangible examples to draw it on, and that's sort of our purposes. So we appreciate the backdrop upon which all of this happens, but since it's been feasible for prior Class 1 categories, that's what we're trying to focus on now when we look at whether we can expand it.
I guess I can just respond and say, we have attempted, notwithstanding that very dangerous backdrop for folks, to assemble a large variety of examples that we think are very probative in the same way that the record has been in past proceedings that establish the need to expand this exemption. But I want to tee into Mr. Williams' comments here, we are now engaged in this line drawing exercise where we have to take every one of those examples and we want to divide among genres. We want to divide among specific films. We need to have a specific analysis of each example that's on the record. So it's not just good enough for us to provide examples. We have to prove that they are non-infringing, and we have to do some sort of fair use analysis. And we're really troubled by that. And we want to underscore that this is the only opportunity that folks have to be able to make these sort of films and to sketch what all of that looks like out in advance for 3 years is not the burden that the statute demands. It demands a showing of likely adverse effects. And I think what you've seen in the comments, and I think what you've heard here today and what Ms. Tandy will speak to in a moment, go far beyond satisfying what Section 1201 requires. So we really urge the office to view these examples in light of the backdrop of this proceeding.
If I could ask a question or two, if I might. There's this sort of undercurrent, and Mr. Taylor sort of teed this up a little bit in one of the comments that he made, and I just wanted to ask this. Why in the ebook sense, and I want to leave film aside for a second, why in the ebook sense that you guys are asking for here, didn't you go for the sort of broader category in the mixed video or for your fan fiction and the cosplay things you're talking about? Is it because the clip that you're using is a lengthier clip and you're not really messing with that clip, you're just inserting it into, and I went to some of the things you talked about, the Dubliner, it looked to me like it was a sophisticated blog and a series of articles that people wrote that were posted. It seemed to me that that's more akin to the other things that you're talking about. Is it because you're not messing with the film itself, you're not changing the actual content that's talked about in the remix type of category? Because he talked about there's fiction allowed in that section, but it's not allowed here as the current exemption is written. So can you address that a little bit? Why you went to this, looking at the ebook rather than at the remix style for your exemption for this part?
Mr. Cheney, I may misunderstand your question, but if the question is whether we are in support of a broader exemption that might wrap all of these together, I believe everybody involved in the ebooks exemption endorses the broader approach as well.
Well, and let me tease that out just a little bit longer. The ebook that we talked about in the past is a very sophisticated ebook intended for publication, right? So it wasn't something that was just going to be posted on the web. It was something intended more for publication, and that's why you needed the higher quality film and some of those kinds of things that were built into that exemption. So in this case, you're not talking about, from what I can tell, higher quality type film that you need to get clips for and those kinds of things. That hasn't been brought home to me in this, and that was sort of brought out by what Mr. Taylor said and some of the things you've indicated here. So can you help with that a little bit?
If it's okay for me to take the answer to that one, these days, what you're putting on the web can be incredibly high quality. I mean, right now, on our phones, we're able to shoot high quality video and we're able to distribute it. So being able to incorporate something that is what people are used to seeing and what the kind of visual quality they're used to seeing, basically goes along with that. One of the reasons we haven't really talked about needing exemptions for fan fiction and fan art is because, of course, that doesn't involve pulling anything off of visual content. It's all textual, or it's all hand-drawn, or it's all sculptural, painted, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're talking about here is the other different kinds of fan works. And of course, people have been doing fan films going all the way back to the 1960s. I myself was editing on a 3-deck VHS thing connected to an Amiga back when I was in college. And now we have sophistication. The quality of the video that I was working with, things that I was videotaping off of the regular television back in 1990 is, you know, the kind, like 1/10 or 1/50th of the kind of quality that we're shooting on a daily basis, like I said, just from our phones. So we have a situation here where we want things, where people want to create things that match up visually with what people are used to seeing in terms of visual sophistication. And yes, that can be published right to the web. So I'm having a bit of a hard time seeing a differentiation between published, and by that do you mean downloadable, you know, via Amazon or via Kindle books or something like that, or something that somebody is just uploading themselves. Even, you know, right before YouTube launched in like 2005, 2006, people were putting up fan vids in AVI format on their own personal websites, and people were downloading it, and people who still don't trust YouTube or Vimeo are continuing to do that to this day. Just because we have another format that automatically compresses things into different file levels and different speed levels and different download times doesn't mean that people aren't still taking other approaches. So I could create something that is an ebook that's a PDF, or something that is a ebook and a multimedia ebook as a PowerPoint, and you know, that moves through at specific speeds that I program into it, and it doesn't require anything other than access to Google Drive.
So in a sense, you're expanding what we thought about as the ebook in the past, and it's really can be included in all of these sorts of forms of including both text and film clips. And that's sort of what the direction that this is going, if I'm understanding what you're saying here.
Yes, although it doesn't necessarily include text in the sense of, you know, the way that we think about it, where you know, you can copy and paste it, because sometimes people are creating an ebook where all of the text in it is included in JPEGs. So it's JPEGs and video clips mixed together with little, if anything, that's that's copyrightable textual content in the sort of way that you would think of something coming off of a computer or off a typewriter, because you want a specific visual impression that you're creating here. So you want to create the font in the way that people will see it exactly, rather than having it come up with whatever their computer or their phone allows.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful. Just we are kind of running out of time, so I do want to make sure to get to other topics. So, Mr. Williams, specifically, there were a couple follow-up questions from previous discussions I wanted to ask you about. So, the filmmakers and ebook people might also feel the same way. Is if someone oversteps the line, then why can't the joint creators or the content owners just sue? Why is it necessary to have the current limitations, and it's not sufficient just to be bounded by the comment and criticism and the short portions limitations?
Sure. And I think this relates to why I had my placard up, so I'll try to combine the answer with what I was planning to say. Jack had referenced previously that, you know, it's clear that no infringement has ever resulted from any of these exemptions, and therefore it will not result from any of the expansions. And our position has been throughout these proceedings before the non-commercial video exemption was granted that there's already a lot of infringement happening, that a large portion of those videos are infringing, and that has continued throughout each cycle. We've identified examples that we feel are infringing, and so we have chosen not to continue to oppose those exemptions, because once the office a couple of times reaches a conclusion, you know, we don't beat our head against the wall. We respect the office's conclusions, but that's not a concession on our part that there's been no harm caused and no infringement taking place. That said, I think it's important to remember that Section 106 already existed before Section 1201, and Congress chose to grant a new right related to unauthorized access, and that's why we're all here. And so to say that, well, let's just let everyone have at it and let the litigation sort it out, it's not a very comforting proposition because, litigation is a very burdensome process.
But I don't think Ms. Chauvet is suggesting that. I think she's saying if there's a quantum of, films that are likely non-infringing, if you allow these limitations of criticism and short portions, and if one or two gets through, don't you still have 106 actionable, and why wouldn't that be a reasonable way for the office to look at this rulemaking?
I don't think it would be one or two, I guess is my primary answer. As I've been saying, I've seen very few examples actually in the record of non-infringing uses in the fictional space especially, but even in the non-fiction ebook space, there's really only a couple of examples that I can think of. This Digital Dubliners, I did look at that as well. I didn't read through the whole thing, but it uses some audiovisual clips and didn't appear to be a fictional work, and from what I saw, it had some good arguments as to making fair use, but then again, I don't know all of the circumstances involved with selection of those clips. So I don't think it would be one or two. I think it would be seen as the office endorsing a broad swath of content and would lead to misuse. And even in the initial recommendation and subsequent recommendations related to non-commercial videos, the office had said there's a lot of stuff in the record that we think is probably infringing, and yet what we hear time and again when we come back from proponents is the office has already decided that all of this is non-infringing and there's no harm. And so I do think it would be seen as an endorsement of a broad swath of conduct that the office doesn't actually, one, have a chance to analyze carefully, and two, doesn't intend to endorse.
So then just to clarify, so say we were to extend it, but we still had the purposes of comment and criticism, short portion, but then we added for non-commercial purpose. In your view, that's still not sufficient?
Yeah, as I was trying to say, and I'll say for the record, this is Matt Williams. As I tried to say earlier, non-commercial in and of itself is not enough. It is a factor to consider, and then it has layers to it. So one type of commercial use is going out in the market and trying to make a profit off of your work. Another type of commercial use under the case law is just avoiding paying the customary licensing fee to make use of a work. And so that is a form of commercial use, at least under fair use. So I'm not sure which way the office is using the term, whether it's kind of more in the plain language meaning or what the case law has said. But that by itself is not enough. You still have to look at the other factors. And yes, short portions is very important, as we've said before. Criticism and commentary is very important. But none of those things add up to a slam dunk in every case. Even in the Campbell case, where they found that it was transformative, that it was criticism and commentary, they remanded to the lower court to take a look at the fourth factor more carefully and make sure that that type of use in that specific instance wasn't going to interfere with the market and cause harm. And so it's a very careful analysis that's required, and I appreciate the spot you're in because you're trying to make sure that you're doing your job and addressing fair uses when you see them. But I just think that this space is a very hard one to draw lines where we can feel comfortable that almost all of the activity is going to be fair. And in the documentary space, we've come to live with it. In the short videos with short portion space, we've come to live with it. But as you've concluded in the last two rounds, there's just not enough clarity in the fictional space to get there. And so I think this record is very similar to the record we had last time, and I don't see a reason to expand this under what we've been shown so far.
So I do want to turn to licensing and kind of keep the conversation going. So, Mr. Williams, the Joint Creators stated in the comments that motion pictures are even more broadly available for licensing today. Is there any evidence that you can point us to suggest that this is true?
Yes, so we have a large number of links in our comments to websites that provide easy access to the contact points that you need to reach in order to engage in licensing. I think we've almost always been able to point to some websites that have contact information posted, but some of the ones we've provided this time are much more interactive. For example, the CNN site is one I can think of where you could actually go on and say, you know, I'm looking for a clip from this period of time of this specific person, and a bunch of different clips will pop up, and you can say, I want to use this in a fictional film, in a documentary film, I want to use this in an educational setting, and they give you different pricing. It pops up almost immediately on the site, and so that makes the licensing more available in my view.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Ms. Ofterhide, I think it would be good to respond specifically to Mr. Williams' statement, because if there are, as he did indicate in the comments that there are, even for like news reporting, which has been desired to be used, like CNN has its own licensing site, or some of these motion studios, and at least in the last rulemaking, it was noted that one of the difficulties with licensing is it's difficult to identify the content providers or to have a very lengthy kind of negotiation. So it would seem that with those types of organizations or websites, that it would make it more available, or at least easier, or at least address some of the concerns that were previously in existence before.
Because I'm a critic and a historian, I want to cede to my filmmaker colleagues here to give you specifics.
I'd be happy
to
Mr. tell you how darn hard it is to license certain things that they're saying is so easy.
Well, I guess my specific question is, if the identification of having some movie studios with websites saying, by genre, you have these different clips available, you know who the actual content owner is in that sense, it doesn't seem like there would be a lengthy negotiation. So does that alleviate some of the concerns that were expressed in the previous rulemaking? That is my specific question.
The answer is no.
Okay.
But it is easier to find out that they have the thing you want. Two things. Number one, it doesn't say on those sites that, by the way, if what you're looking for has an anchor and you're going to put it into a film that has a point of view, like most documentaries do, we won't license it at all. Oliver Stone found that out on Snowden, where he couldn't get them. And the other thing is, it used to be that you'd call and a human would answer, and now it's very hard if the posted price is like beyond what the filmmaker could possibly afford, because the film is small or the market for the film is quite niche. Getting a call back is really, I can't tell you the number of complaints I get from filmmakers, and sorry, nothing I can do about it because I can't get through either.
Ms. Wertheimer?
Lauren Wertheimer. One additional issue with licensing is that we've provided evidence for the record that a lot of licensing agreements include clauses, like non-disparagement clauses that state the licensee can't make critical use of the licensed clip, not critical or disparaging, and they actually use the word critical. So even with a license, if they can't make criticism, they can't make fair use.
Mr. Williams, I want to put you on the spot, or Mr. Taylor, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but what is your response to that? So the fact that there are these disparagement clauses in licenses, if that's going to prevent people from entering into a license to get it, how is there a licensing market to be had?
Sure. So this is something that's come up at least the last two cycles, and has not ultimately justified granting an exemption. A number of the copyright owners do include non-disparagement clauses. I think the record has shown not all of them do. I'm pretty sure that previous records show that Warner Brothers did not have non-disparagement clauses in its licenses, and so I'm not sure that Mr. Donaldson's reference to CNN telling you you won't be able to use it in certain ways is accurate. But
there was the example of the Miramax licensing agreement that did actually contain a
Yes, I'm not
disparagement.
denying that there are non-disparagement agreements in a lot of licensing agreements. There's a few things. I don't actually think there's any examples that anyone has offered that involved actual criticism of the studio or of any of the actors or really in this record of the films themselves. And so I don't think that those provisions would prevent licensing of the works that are actually in the record. The other thing is that some of those relate more to, issues about disparagement of the talent that provides services to the studios. And I haven't heard anything relevant to that in the record either. So,
Though they do give the example of the movie 1984 with Steve Jobs, that the Jobs family didn't like how it was going to be used, and so they refused to enter a license.
Yes.
I mean, isn't that an example
well,
of...
so Universal in that example exercised fair use. They didn't get a license because it was denied them, which is a bit of a different question than this issue.
But it is an example of a license being refused because they didn't like how it was going to be used in the film.
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to say that there are no copyright owners who would like to avoid being criticized. That's an undeniable fact. In that film, and you saw a brief clip of it there, and that's been in the record in prior cycles as well, the Jobs family apparently did not liked the film and didn't want to license it. Universal moved forward. I think if you saw the way they used it, they didn't just show the entire thing. They had a mixture of the audience worked into the scenery, watching it on a big screen, and so they made certain creative choices about the way to use it. I don't think that one example standing alone would justify an exemption.
But if it affects how they're going to make the film, like if it limits how they can use a motion clip for fair use, how is licensing a feasible alternative in that scenario?
Well, I'm not saying that licensing is always a feasible alternative. Clearly, in that case where the license was denied, you can't say that a license was available to be had. What I am saying is that the examples of that in this record and in all the prior records are very, very few and far between. And I've also heard frequently that it's unacceptable to condition the exemption on asking for the license and being denied in the first instance. And so if you only wanted to target those examples, I think you would end up with an exemption that the proponents would be unhappy with because they don't even want to go ask in the first place.
I have a quick question for Mr. Taylor. So regarding the market for multimedia ebooks, so actually both you and Mr. Turnbull, you guys in your joint submission stated that there actually is no such market for the ebooks. So if there is no market for multimedia ebooks or it's very small, how can there be an adverse effect on the clip licensing market?
I don't think that we said that there would be an adverse effect on the clip licensing market.
No, you didn't, but you said that there is no market. So
Right,
my
exactly.
question is, if there's no market for multimedia ebooks, then how can there be a clip licensing market for multimedia ebooks?
If you believe that there is a robust multimedia ebook market, our argument is that if that market were to develop, then we think that those authors should have to license work just like they would if they were doing it in the documentary. And we noted that there were a lot of potential or works that were proffered by people who are also documentary filmmakers. And so if you expect the documentary filmmaker to license, or the non-documentary filmmaker to license works, then you can just as equally expect them to license works for the multimedia ebooks.
So to follow up and maybe to give Mr. Williams the answer, is it the motion picture studio's view that the ebooks multimedia market is a traditional, reasonable, or likely to be developed market? And if so, is there anything in the written comments you can point us to back that up?
I think it is, at the very least, a potential or likely to be developed market. Last cycle, Simon Swart from Fox testified that they would be willing to license multimedia ebooks, from what I recall, and we do have Ben Scheffner from MPAA who's going to testify in Los Angeles on issues related to licensing as well as the importance of access controls.
Thank you. I think it will be helpful to hear from Mr. Scheffner with specifics in Los Angeles so that we can understand more about the licensing part from the proponents. Mr. Welch?
Yeah, if I could, thank you. Josh Welch, Film Independent. I wanted to go back just briefly to the basic distinction between documentary and fiction film, because it's obviously running throughout this. And in terms of filmmaker practices today, and this is picking up on what Professor Al-Jahadi said, there really is a growing trend towards blurring the line between documentary and fiction film. And these aren't just one-off films that are kind of odd cases. It's a growing genre of hybrid films that employ documentary and fiction elements. And in 2011, one of the major documentary award shows in the United States, the Cinema Eye Honors, introduced a new award. It's the Heterodox Award, specifically to recognize films that are kind of unclassifiable. They're both fiction and documentary. And I think you see, to name a couple examples, in 2018, Alex Gibney's series, The Looming Tower, it's a 10-part series about Al-Qaeda. It's a fiction scripted series that has substantial documentary components in it. And the whole point of this approach to filmmaking is to have the fiction and the traditional documentary segments play off each other. Another one is Errol Morris's Wormwood, also on Netflix, where it's the same thing. He had actors doing scripted scenes intercut with archival footage and documentary interviews, and they comment on each other. You don't have that genre of filmmaking without both elements.
And how are those examples of films for the purposes of comment and criticism?
So I'm not citing them as examples of that. I'm citing them as examples of why I think granting or denying an exemption based on a film genre is problematic when the genre itself is so porous. I mean, that would be my argument. And the other thing I want to emphasize is this is really a growing segment of the filmmaking world today. I think this is a very exciting development and growth area for film. And so again, it just doesn't make sense to me that you would grant or deny an exemption based on what genre a film falls in.
Great, thank you. I want to ask a few other questions more towards the adverse effect. And I know people have been waiting.
Do you think we could let Professor Al-Jahadi, just since she wrote the book on documentary filmmaking, just speak to that one point first?
Well, when I'm not writing books on documentary film, what I've been doing since 2004 is to work with different creative communities to figure out what happens to them if they don't understand what their fair use rights are. And we've developed, and I've worked with our colleague Peter Yassi, we've developed a category of thinking about this called imagination foregone, which is what happens, what do you not do if you think this is probably something that's prohibited? And there are large categories, I can share this data with you, but there's instance after instance of people excluding entire categories of behavior. And this is what worries me about looking for specific ways in which people are now using this stuff that can that justify your logic that this will be probably not infringing, or that there are imaginable non-infringing uses, because a lot of people are not imagining it. And this heterodox category is labeled heterodox precisely because it's unusual. So I don't think we want to restrict that. When I'm just going to name some classes of filmic behaviors that it's not hard at all to see how you could incorporate commentary and criticism. You have topical dramas on television like Roseanne, Blackish, Insecure. And you can imagine each one of, South Park, each one of, that's not a drama, each one of these is an example of where top copyrighted material has been incorporated, could be incorporated in order to facilitate the topical criticism or commentary of particular things, like how anchors behave or what a president said. You have parodies and satire, which are naturals for incorporating material for criticism or commentary. And I'm sorry, Spaceballs, there you go. And music videos. So if you have entire classes of and subgenres where they're all fiction, where it's easy to see a defensible use of uncleared material, is that of any help in your thinking? Thank you.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I have two questions about the adverse effects, and then I know that Mr. Taylor and Mr. Turnbull have a video that they want to briefly, maybe, can you get that ready? It's queued up, okay. So very quickly, before we turn to the video, so AACS-LA and DVD-CCA, they assert that technological limitations such as memory storage it's actually what is holding back the multimedia ebook market and not TPMs. Can I have a response, please, from the ebook proponents?
I can try and speak to that. I don't think that that's really an issue because it depends on what you're thinking of as a multimedia ebook. As I said before, you can create something that's a multimedia ebook in PowerPoint. And while it's very important to be able to have high quality and high resolution content within that, it's not the kind of thing that someone's necessarily precluded from doing on a home machine. So it sounds like Dr. Lerner wants to go along with that.
All right, Mr. Lerner.
Thank you, Jack Lerner. I just wanted to add to what Ms. Danny was saying. So audiobooks, for example, can be anywhere from 250 megabytes to up to a gigabyte or more. And people download audiobooks to their phones all the time. So any technological limitations on data have mostly gone by the wayside. You know, you can fit 1 or 2 gigs onto your phone, not to mention your PC or your Kindle Reader, pretty easily. I also want to just take this opportunity, as long as we're talking about ebooks and how they're made and so on. When we talk about ebooks, we're talking about the ability to take a package of materials and be able to access those materials offline, and those materials are sort of packaged in one file, right? And so we're not talking about games, period. What we are talking about is some interactivity that might be enabled within that ebook. So, for example, maybe you click on something to enable a video component, and maybe you don't. But what I also want to point out is the bigger trend here and the bigger point here, which is that this is about promising new technology where you have legions, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people out there wanting to create ebooks, whether it's thousands of professors, whether it's fan fiction creators, whether it's film scholars that want to go out and say, okay, well, I want to conduct criticism and commentary through all of these different, quite heterogeneous ways. And I want to do so using the new technology that's available. And so what we have is this fancy new technology, and we have people out there actually innovating around that based on their desire to create and on the ebook form. And so I just wanted to give you that context, and thank you for indulging me on that.
No, and I wanted to ask a specific question about, because the proponents of the ebook expansion, they do reference technologies like RenP, Curie, Fulcrum to create multimedia ebooks. So I guess, is circumvention necessary to use those technologies?
Jack Lerner, I don't think circumvention is necessary to use the technologies. What's necessary
or I guess to use them to create the multimedia books that you seek under this exemption. Is circumvention of TPMs necessary?
Well, we absolutely think so, right? You can make an ebook, you can make a multimedia ebook, and maybe that multimedia ebook is something that you give to your students, and it's really maybe it's it's not something where you would require the high fidelity. But we've suggested in the record and in the previous record that there are a lot of situations where having high definition, high fidelity content is extremely important. And Ms. Tandy's example is an important one. We have others, Kirby Ferguson and others in the record, who'd like to do this. And so it's not a question of, do you have to circumvent to use the technologies? It's a question of how many people aren't going to be able to use those technologies in the way that the law says they can, except for Section 1201, and are cut off from doing that.
And I'll try and keep just an addendum to that to one sentence. If we put in a restriction on people's ability to use their creativity, just as the documentary filmmaking people were saying before, it's the same kind of thing for ebooks, because by giving people the knowledge that they can do these kinds of things creatively, then they're going to start being able to put a different kind of creativity in a different kind of form. And by taking away these restrictions of fear that, I mean, I spent years working with especially teenagers who are afraid that somebody is going to come to their house and arrest them for writing fan fiction. We all know that that's not the case, but it's still a fear, and it's still a rumor, and it's still a hypothetical that people talk about. And being able to have these kinds of conversations here and being able to say, no, this sort of thing is not barred, gives people the ability to just let their imagination take wing. And it's a fantastic thing to be able to see teenagers, young adults, people of any age going forward with that sort of creative content process in a new kind of format.
Great, thank you. For Mr. Taylor and Mr. Turnbull, DVDCCA and AACSLA suggests that the rulemaking should not focus on prospective uses. In your opposition comments at page 21, but the statute is prospective, and then it asks us to look at adverse effects that are likely to occur within the next 3 periods. So how is it not appropriate to examine prospective adverse uses or adverse effects or prospective uses?
Well, I think that where we said was that the prospective uses, as far as the fair use analysis, it's almost impossible to tell. And so if you conflate the 2 points, then yes, you could argue exactly what the proponents have, but there is a distinction that if you are going to argue that something should be allowed for an exemption, you have to demonstrate sufficiently on the record that that exemption is indeed more likely than not non-infringing. And what we've complained about here is that they have not done that. And you had asked earlier, what's the problem with going ahead and approving a larger exemption and just following up with a copyright suit after there's been a violation? And the problem is that the rulemaking is tasked by creating an exemption based on the evidence that's produced in this rulemaking. And so the fact that they haven't proffered enough evidence really is fatal to their case. And the fact is that it's not, these arguments are the same arguments that we had last time around. And so if they wanted to prepare, if they wanted these exemptions or needed these exemptions, they could have come in with better evidence that demonstrates their actual need for it. And you'll see in the clip, it's not hard to make an iBook. And they could have done that. I'm not saying that the filmmakers necessarily would have to go out and make a filmmaker to demonstrate the evidence, but there are ways that they could have introduced evidence.
Mr. Trimble, do you have anything to add? And then perhaps we can see the video.
Very, very quickly, it seems to me that sorry, I lost my point. Give me 1 second.
Do you have any comment on prospective uses or what Mr. Taylor
Yeah,
just
the issue isn't that you can't. It's that there still needs to be evidence that there is something that's actually being prevented. And the point that I had wanted to make was, Mr. Cheney hit on something that had been occurring to me throughout the course of the discussion today, which is that Certainly in the last round and in much of the comment that was filed, the focus was on the much more elaborate platform of the ebook. We had somebody who's prominent in Hollywood who wanted to make ebook, multimedia ebook, and our point was, first of all, none of what was proffered 3 years ago has actually come forward, and secondly, that the platforms that they were talking about are in fact limitations. Now, other platforms may not be, but the ones that were talked about in the sort of classical in the more formalized ebook context do have the limitations, and that's what our comments go into in some detail.
Can I ask just to follow up? In what's presented, if you start to see trends, we saw that at the very beginning presentation where you have sort of a 0 at the beginning and then you end up with a 109. Is that trend analysis, does that give enough to give perspective that something is more than likely going to occur? That sort of analysis, is that helpful in this sort of looking at perspective? Because we may have some creative things being thought about, but then we start to just see this inkling of a trend. Does that give enough for the perspective for the Copyright Office to recommend that there needs to be an exemption?
Yeah, I mean, you need to have the evidence of that, I think, is really our perspective. And for the ebook, again, what we were pointing out was that, we had a number of things that were brought forward 3 years ago that didn't happen. There was discussion of the platforms that, in fact, have the inhibitions. Now, again, the non-formalized, maybe in a broader sense, ebook, may present a little different question. And if the issue is that the formulation of non-commercial videos, if somehow people feel inhibited because they don't view what they've done as a video, I don't want to go out too far on a limb here, but it may be that is the place to look at what has been the focus of the discussion here today, whether something could be crafted around whether presented in whatever format or however, if that would facilitate some of the fan fiction kinds of things, rather than tackling a much broader category of ebook, that may be a way to look at it that would facilitate some of the sort of non-commercial uses.
Okay, great. I think we're going to go ahead and let's show your video. Okay.
Could I just quickly speak to the trend question?
Sure.
Sorry.
Would it be possible?
Very briefly, because
Yeah.
we are very short on time.
I think it was a good question. If I understood the presentation correctly, it was kind of a trend within Mr. Donaldson's practice that he has seen in terms of how many people are coming into him wanting to exercise fair use in fictional films. But I think his starting premise was that people were not using film clips in fictional films before that trend started to go up in his own practice, and I don't think that's accurate. I mean, if you look back at Oliver Stone movies going a long way back, Natural Born Killers is one that comes to mind. I think it's a practice that's been referred to as vertical editing. He'll use a lot of different types of clips at times to show what's going on in a character's head, instead of trying to just have you read that on the screen through the actor's performance. And I think that because most of those were released by major studios, that those were probably licensed clips, and there's been licensing of those types of clips for a long, long time. So while I credit the testimony that in his practice he's seen an increase maybe in the number of people coming to him with questions, I would dispute that there's not always, but for a long time there's been use of clips in fictional films, and I think almost always they've been licensed.
Great, thank you. Let's have the video, please.
Would it be possible to make a point while they're setting up? I wanted to respond to what,
Let's have the video, and then I will let you
course.
have your stuff.
Showing that this is a test, and this is for the purposes of showing how I, the author, would work with some of the screen captures we have done. And if you just click on here, I've added some of the text from some of the pilots that we've done. And right now, what I'm going to do is show you that these clips can be inserted into the author, and this is a widget that they provide. And this is the town clip 2. This is one of the screen capture clips that we submit with our opposition. So all you have to do is just drag it to the widget. And right now the widget is optimizing. And we'll just play it back in this author mode. Seems like it will play. So I'm going to show you what it looks like in what they have as preview. And to do that, I click here on preview. And this is what the book would look like if you were in the iBook store. And looks pretty similar. This is the page. And all right, so I'm going to close out the preview. Something else that I wanted to show you, what that is what happens when we use a really large file. And right here, this clip is something that I created to approximate a HG clip, which would be 1.35 gigs. And it's going to take a little bit of time to optimize, as they call it. Here we are, and the video has finished optimizing, and we have a warning from iBook, which says your book's total movie and audio file size is 1.51 gigs. iBook Store doesn't accept books larger than 2 gigs. To make your book smaller, you might need to reduce the number or size of media files. So this is basically consistent with what we know, is that the iBook Store will only accept multimedia books no larger than 2 gigabytes. So click on say OK. So we're here at the iBook Store because after compiling the clips in the iBook author, I decided to see whether or not Apple would accept an iBook made with screen captured clips. And in fact, Apple does. So I'm going to click here, put in my name. Click over here, law. Scroll down, and here we have it. 1201 Proceeding, David Taylor, and 1.51 gigs. This is the book. I've already downloaded it, so I'm just click here on read. And here we have that clip, which was 1.35 gigs, and which generated the warning about the size that iBook ultimately uses. And then if I scroll through the pages, this is that very first clip, which I showed you how the widget is used to import video into it, play it over with it. screen capture clips. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Can I ask a question about that specifically? Does anyone here about ebooks want to speak as to why that's not a reasonable and available alternative to circumvention?
Heidi Tandy. I just don't understand why we're being conceptually limited to the idea of what Apple permits via iBooks when this is something that someone can create as a standalone download or have available via, without using a commercial mechanism.
I don't know that's responsive to, is that a reasonable alternative to circumvention to create the work, whether it's on the Apple Store or anywhere else?
But that's what I'm not understanding, why we necessarily need to find an alternative just because it happens to comport with something that Apple's put up as a restriction.
I don't think it has to do with the Apple restriction. We're evaluating whether there's alternative to circumvention for the availability of use of copyrighted works, and is that widget a sufficient alternative?
I don't think I'm able to really understand from this video clip how this widget works as some sort of a workaround. Maybe there's something in this that I'm missing.
Well, I think we're looking at, he was able to create this without circumventing a TPM, and he's saying, essentially it looks pretty good, which is, there's been concern that without circumventing the access controls on Blu-ray or on DVD, you will not be able to create a high quality work using clips. So I'm just specifically to that.
I'm primarily going to defer to Angel on the technological aspect of that, but the widget, it doesn't have the same sort of a visual import as what you might necessarily want to be able to put into this.
In what way? I mean, it wasn't dropping frames, it wasn't skittering, it wasn't creating the stutter effect you were talking about earlier.
But it doesn't have the same sort of visual narrative and context that you would necessarily be looking for.
Like what specifically in the image would you have seen if you had circumvented a DVD or a Blu-ray that you were not seeing?
Well, I'm not sure how they even were able to get these kinds of high-resolution clips. The minute you start trying to do those high-resolution clips, you're automatically losing some of the content and some of the context.
I'm not contending like it's a technological matter, it wasn't lossless or anything, but in terms of what the eye sees, I think is what we're trying to understand. I mean, I don't know if...
Well, and then the whole issue of linking that content together to be able to try and create something is incredibly, incredibly complicated. To be able to do all of that, you need a desktop computer. You need to be able to work with something that has that degree of basically knitting together capability. And you have to be able to, my understanding is that you have to be able to obtain additional software in order to do it on. And that's not necessarily the kind of thing that everybody is able to have access to.
So are you saying it's different using this clip than if you had ripped it? For the software you can use for editing, like what program would you use and how would it be different?
Well, if I was, for example, if I was using Windows Movie Maker, I wouldn't be able to create those kinds of clips. Maybe you can do it in certain kinds of professional level Adobe kinds of things, but I primarily use Windows Movie Maker. So to be able to get those kinds of clips in Windows Movie Maker, I can do it just by ripping and then by editing it out. But if I'm trying to do it by knitting together individual stills, it doesn't have the same sort of frame speed to be able to do it in that kind of a process.
Okay, I wonder if Mr. Taylor or Mr. Turnbull can speak as to whether you can get this into Windows Movie Maker or editing for that. Go ahead.
What I think the disconnect here is, this is not knitting together individual stills. This is a form of screen capture that is capturing the entire video. So it's not screen capture in a snapshot. It's screen capture. It's a screen capture program that captures the video. And we were making, I think, 2 points with this presentation. Number one, that as Ms. Smith indicated, that the quality is quite good and doesn't have the sort of jittery and that sort of thing. And in fact, the technology has developed over the course of the 12 years or so that we've been looking at screen capture in this proceeding. The second thing is, other proponents, not people here today, had made the case that iBook, some of the multimedia formats would not accept video if it was at the quality of screen capture, and the point here was simply that they do. And that may not be the format that the proponents who are present today are talking about, but it is a format that has been brought up in the course of the proceeding, and so that point was being made by the video.
Thank you. Mr. Morissette, do you have a view as to whether this technique or any other techniques would or would not be sufficient for a film festival or filmic distribution?
They would not. Filmmakers today have even more gatekeepers and high technical requirements from distributors than ever before. And I want to say that the exemption in its current state is working beautifully for us, because the availability of pulling clips from Blu-ray discs has meant the difference whether we can even use fair use clips anymore. Case in point, last year we released a movie called Abacus, which was about a small bank in New York. It was the only bank that had jailed owners during the financial crisis. And we wanted to use a clip from It's a Wonderful Life, the Jimmy Stewart movie we see every year at Christmas. And lo and behold, the Blu-ray was out with that movie. So we immediately bought it on Amazon, used the provisions in the current exemption to pull just the clip that we needed, cut it into our show, and it passed through with flying colors to every QC portal that we had to go through. The movie was on public television, which has draconian technical standards of microseconds of jitter or repeated frames or whatever. It was also shown theatrically, which meant that the file had to be reconverted to XYZ color space in order to get onto a DCP file based for theatrical projection. And almost every documentary filmmaker that I know of sends their films to film festivals first, then gets a contract, and then it ends up on Netflix, which, because Netflix is creating their own content now, they're even more strict than ever about the file that you send it. So screen capture is, from my viewpoint and my test, pretty much where it was 3 years ago. To have to play a high definition file on a computer and capture it in real time with perfect framing, it just can't be done. And this year, Abacus went to the Oscars. Yet again, another QC. We were nominated for Academy Award for 2 of our films. Abacus was nominated, and we didn't win, unfortunately. But it wasn't because of technical problems. It was that we had a lot of artistic competition.
So, Mr. Turnbull, is there any harm in retaining the screen capture limitations?
No, I mean, our view is that we ought to retain the screen capture limitation. I think Mr. Morissette has indicated that the current exemption is working fine from his perspective, because in the cases where, in fact, it is not, and you can, say, you're allowed to make the determination that screen capture is not sufficient for the particular use, then, we have not objected to retaining the current exemption. But we think that the screen capture is important because in many instances you're not in those kinds of circumstances, and for many kinds of purposes, particularly where you're dealing with large numbers of people who are doing amateur things, where I think the risk of that bleeding over into the removal of the TPM altogether, I think screen capture is a good alternative and ought to be retained.
Okay, thank you for your perspective. There's a lot of placards up, but I do have one specific question, so maybe we can do like a show of hands if someone can speak to this specifically. Does anyone think that there is a need for an exemption for screen capture? I would just like to see for a show of hands if you think yes, because it has been contested that maybe it's not necessary, you don't need an exemption for screen capture, and that the exemption is confusing. Okay.
Can I ask for clarification? When you say an exemption for screen capture, what exactly do you mean?
I think that's in the current
Yeah, it's in both
language.
the ebooks and the filmmaking exemptions.
You're referring to the language
Yes.
that requires
Yes.
the author to engage in some sort of investigation as to whether screen
No, that's
capture-
not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in 20140, It says, when circumvention is undertaken using screen capture technology that appears to be offered to the public as enabling the reproduction of motion pictures after content has been lawfully acquired or decrypted. So I'm not talking about considering whether screen capture might work for you, but whether there needs to be a specific regulatory exemption to engage in screen capture, because if that is not involving circumvention anyways, it seems like it's not serving any purpose for the office or the librarian to implement a rule allowing you to do it.
I think I can respond to this. So this is the A prong of both of the exemptions. I think the answer to that question is entirely contingent on what you do with the B prong. In other words, the existence of that exemption is tied into the prospect that you might need to use screen capture. We think if you blow away B, as we've asked you to do, the likelihood that we need A, folks are not going to be using.
That's not making sense to me. Do you violate 1201A if you engage in screen capture sans an exemption, or do you not?
I'm not sure that we know the answer to that question.
Does anyone think it is a violation from a technological reason or have a reason? Mr. Williams?
So I'm not going to answer that question as yes, but I'm going to try to provide some nuance. I think the reason that the exemptions are drafted the way they are now is that there do appear to be a number of screen capture programs that do not constitute circumvention devices. We haven't analyzed all of them, but it appears that sometimes screen capture captures the image after it has been lawfully decrypted, and at that point nothing has to be circumvented. However, over the years, proponents had expressed some concern that they might accidentally engage in circumvention because they don't know which devices are legitimate screen capture and which are not. So I think what the office tried to do is say, we want to encourage you to, when it makes sense for your project, when you can get the level of quality you need, to use lawful screen capture. And so if it's marketed as lawful screen capture and you use it, but it happens to end up being that it's a circumvention device and you weren't aware of that, you're still protected. And so I see that as a good idea. It's not something we came up with, but I think it was a good idea because it basically gives proponents comfort that if they think they're engaging in something that is not circumvention, using something that's marketed as a screen capture tool, then they can do that without fear of violating the statute. But then there's also built into that, as Bruce was saying, that if there's a project that requires higher quality and they have a good faith belief that they need that higher quality, they can exercise the other piece.
But I mean, I guess I'm wondering, this illegitimate screen capture, I'm not aware of any specific technology that people say, I'm not sure about that or I'm scared about that. I think the Apple phone has a button which can enable you to do screen capture. So I assume maybe at least Apple is pretty confident that it doesn't engage in circumvention. So I'm just wondering if it's serving any real purpose for anyone, if anyone's making use of that.
To the extent.
Mr. Midgley.
Oh, yes, Peter Midgley. To the extent that I believe what I just heard was that the current structure of the rule could provide some comfort to proponents, I can just report that it's providing zero comfort. It's only providing confusion to conflate the issue of, the way that the rule is currently worded makes it sound like screen capture is a form of circumvention, when it seems like the overwhelming majority of the evidence that we see, including the demonstration that was just made, suggests the exact opposite. So it's far from providing comfort to proponents, it's providing confusion.
Ms. Kleiner, did you want to go ahead and ask your distribution limitation question?
If the Register were to recommend expanding the multimedia ebooks exemption to include fiction, would it be reasonable to place distribution limitations or require certain protections to be added to the ebook to prevent readers from taking and using the motion picture clips?
So in a nutshell, is it reasonable to ask for ebook authors to essentially add TPMs back on after the ebook has been created to prevent piracy or for people to like rip it and go and use the motion pictures in a in an infringing way.
So the question is, if I understand correctly, that if people were allowed to use the DMC exemption, then they would also be required to put some kind of DRM on that, correct?
I'm asking if that would be reasonable, if we were to expand the existing exemption to include fiction.
We were surprised to see this because it seems so off the wall. But to us, that seems problematic. First of all, how do you define DRM? I mean, do you mean encryption? Do you mean TBMs? And that's the first question. But a more fundamental question is what you'd really be doing would be saying, okay, if you want to make fair use, which the law says you can do it appropriately. It's straightforward to do it appropriately. But leaving that aside, now you have an additional restriction, which is that you have to make it difficult for someone else to access that. When I take something and make fair use of it, that's my speech. That's my message that I want to get out there.
Sure, and I appreciate that, but like the technologies that are being used to create these multimedia ebooks, do they have the capability to add, whether it be encryption or some other form of protection? Is that, I don't know how easy or difficult that would be.
I'm going to defer to Professor Reed.
I mean, there's no doubt digital rights management technologies, and we might defer that question to our colleagues that sell such products down to the other end of the table. But in general, I think we'd object to the distribution scheme in addition to the reasons that Professor Lerner mentioned, because it's transforming an exemption that's supposed to be looking at the moment of circumvention. To the extent there's post-circumvention behavior that's probative of intent to create a multimedia ebook, that makes sense. But we're now transforming that exemption into what's basically a regulatory regime for the downstream distribution of a product. We think that's pretty far beyond the ambit of what Congress had in mind in delegating authority to the office to engage in this rulemaking. I think that also raises pretty significant First Amendment concerns because you're conditioning the further distribution of speech contingent on the application of some technological protection measure that we basically have no evidence in the record of.
But for Section 110, for example, different context granted, but in like distance education, Congress has basically said that it is appropriate if you are having distance learning where you're using motion picture clip short portions, granted, but that a requirement is to add on protections so that you don't have infringement by third parties who might get a copy of that. So Congress has already evidenced a willingness to go that far.
And I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Midgley, on the contours of Section 110, but I think suffices to say there's no reference that I'm familiar with in Section 1201 itself or in the legislative history to an idea along these lines. We'd ask if the office is considering going down that road. This is obviously raising a lot of complexities that would be given an opportunity to issue some post-hearing comment.
Mr. Midgley, I know we're going to talk so much about this on the next panel, but briefly, if you have a comment about Section 110.
I would just say that the language of Section 110 refers to reasonable and limited portions, not short portions, which the current rules provide. That, among other issues, is why we're suggesting just tying it to the actual statutory requirements of Section 110 instead of trying to do a mini version of those requirements in the context of this rulemaking. But I'll be better prepared to answer the question about the limitations imposed by Congress in Section 110 once I've had a chance to think about it a little bit longer. Thank you.
I guess we're going to wrap up, so this will be the last one. One question I have specific for filmmaking, so we'll start with Mr. Donaldson, is in 2015, the registrar's recommendation concluded that based on the record provided, the registrar couldn't conclude that suggested non-documentary uses were non-infringing. And so what, in your view, has really changed in, high-level summary now that we're here in 2018 that would enable us to look upon the record fresh?
Just the sheer number of filmmakers who are making films that are not labeled or marketed as documentaries, but they want to use especially archival clips
but also photographs and other material pursuant to fair use. Granted, you define the availability of ripping more narrowly than just all fair use. But what happens, and it's a heartbreaker, I see it frequently, by the way, it's a couple times every month, where somebody who has worked on a documentary for 1 month or 2 months is next working on a feature film. And this, particularly editors and directors who are hands-on in terms of making these decisions, they are wanting to do what they did last month, maybe even using the same material in a similar way. And all of a sudden, it's a criminal act. So it's one thing to have a definition which works at a cocktail party, which works in many, many ways, certainly works in marketing. But we're talking about making activity which is totally legal in May illegal in June because the film they're working on has not been labeled the same way. And as Josh pointed out, this is mainly a marketing term, a self-description. There are a lot of films not labeled documentaries who could have been labeled documentaries, and they're documentaries, and I can think of a number of them, that are not marketed with a documentary label stamped all over them. And yet, that label causes a well-intentioned human being who's working hard and trying to do the right thing, turns him into a criminal just because of the way the film he's working on being labeled. I don't think that's the kind of society we want to live in.
Okay, thank you for your perspective. I don't know if Ms. Ankers still wanted to speak, but maybe you then, Ms. Lerner. If not, we'll go to Professor Lerner.
Yes, Angel Ankers. We just wanted to respond just really quickly to the demonstration. We haven't had the chance to review that software in particular that was demonstrated, and we'd like to have our own demonstration presented at the Los Angeles hearing, so we'll have that prepared then. Thank you.
And I believe Ms. Rosenblatt from OTW, who's scheduled to present at the Los Angeles hearing, will have that on tap.
Okay.
Thank you, Jack Lerner. I just wanted to make one quick response and one quick point, because I know we're low on time. Regarding Bobette Buster, Bobette Buster is a client of the UCI Intellectual Property Arts and Technology Clinic, and I can confirm that she is still working on her book, and you have that testimony in the record, and I can talk about other proponents whose wives, one whose wife passed away and so on, but this brings up an important point that I want to get into the record, and that is that evidence does not have to include exact specific examples for every hypothetical or every permutation of possible adverse effects or infringing effects. Evidence can also include testimonial evidence submitted by experts on the creative practice of communities, and we have submitted substantial testimonial evidence to that effect. We have a number of experts here who have done that, and I would submit that that is more than sufficient, particularly given the utter absence of any concern about piracy, counterfeiting, or increased unauthorized sharing as a result of these exemptions. And thank you for having us today.
Thank you. We appreciate it. We appreciate all of your time and also for going over well into the lunch hour. So I think we will conclude and we will start again at 2:30. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.